Imagine stepping into a grand medieval castle, towering walls, banners flying, armoured knights everywhere. Sounds glamorous, right? Well, here's the shocking truth. Castles were dirtier, smellier, and in many cases deadlier than the tiny villages peasants lived in. Forget fairy tales, living in a stone fortress often meant wading through filth, breathing damp, mouldy air, and battling armies of rats. By the end of this video, you'll never look at castles the same way again. So, ready to peek behind the drawbridge? Let's start with the basics. Castles were made of cold, damp stone. Unlike cosy wooden cottages that absorbed heat, stone walls trapped moisture. Inside, rooms were often dark, drafty, and filled with smoke from open hearths. Mould grew everywhere on walls, on straw bedding, even on food. Peasant huts may have been small and simple, but at least they stayed warmer and drier. And if you think castles had fireplaces in every room, think again. Only the Great Hall had a big hearth, the rest was freezing. Now, let's talk about the smell. Castles had hundreds of people living inside: nobles, soldiers, servants, even animals. And where there are people and animals, there's waste. Medieval castles didn't have modern plumbing. Instead, they had garderobe stone holes in the wall where waste dropped down the side of the castle. No flushing, no pipes, just a stinking chute. Guess what? The waste often collected right under the walls. Invading armies sometimes used it to spread disease during sieges. Gross, right? Compare that to a peasant village. Sure, villages had their own mess, but peasants usually kept waste in dung heaps outside the home, which doubled as fertilizer. At least it wasn't dripping down their bedroom walls. In fact, recent archaeological studies show that village streets were often cleaner than castle courtyards. And while peasants had fewer possessions, their air was fresher, their homes less damp, and their risk of dying from indoor filth surprisingly lower. Makes you wonder, who really lived better? But the dirt wasn't just disgusting, it was deadly. Castles were breeding grounds for disease. Packed halls meant fleas, lice, and rats thrived, spreading everything from typhus to the plague. Remember, the Black Death killed nearly half of Europe in the 14th century, and castles weren't spared. In fact, their dense, closed-in spaces often made outbreaks worse. Want to know the deadliest detail of all? The castle kitchens, supposedly the heart of noble life, were often just as dangerous as the dungeons. Let's step inside the medieval kitchen. Picture huge roasting spits, boiling cauldrons, and open flames licking at greasy wooden beams. Kitchens were usually placed inside the castle itself, making fire a constant danger. Add to that spoiled food, remember, no refrigeration, and you've got a recipe for sickness. Meat often rotted before it reached the table, and spices were used not to enhance flavor, but to hide the stench of decay. For nobles, dining was a gamble. Tonight's feast could mean tomorrow's food poisoning. And here's the twist. Peasants, who often get painted as miserable, actually ate fresher food. They grew their own vegetables, baked bread daily, and slaughtered animals only when needed. No banquet halls filled with spoiled venison here. Their diets were simple but surprisingly nutritious. Archaeologists have even found evidence that peasants had better teeth than nobles, less sugar, fewer rotting meats, and more grains. So, who would you rather dine with, the filthy feast in the castle or the simple stew in a village hut? Another deadly problem? Water. Castles often relied on wells or cisterns, but waste from the garderobes could seep into them. Imagine drawing water for your morning drink, only to find it smelled faintly and suspicious. Villages, on the other hand, usually settled near clean streams or rivers. Sure, those weren't perfect, but at least the water wasn't stored beneath 1,000 stone walls dripping with filth. In a grim twist, noble lords sometimes drank more ale or wine just to avoid their own water supplies. If you're still picturing castles as glamorous, here's a reality check. The courtyards were basically giant trash dumps. Animal carcasses, food scraps, and waste piled up quickly. Servants tossed refuse out of windows, so walking through a castle could mean dodging chamber pots raining from above. Villages had problems too, but on a smaller, more manageable scale. In castles, the sheer number of people turned filth into chaos. But the worst filth of all wasn't on the ground. It was crawling on people. Parasites were everywhere in castles. Fleas lived in the straw mattresses, lice infested the nobles' hair, and rats carried deadly diseases. Even luxurious-looking beds were crawling with bugs. In fact, some nobles shaved their heads and wore wigs just to keep lice at bay. Peasants weren't parasite-free, but their smaller, less crowded homes made infestations easier to handle. In a crowded stone fortress, parasites spread like wildfire, and if you think rats in castles were just a nuisance, wait until you hear about the plague. The plague, yes, the Black Death turned castles into death traps. When the disease swept Europe in the 14th century, no one was safe. Peasants died in villages, but castles became hotspots. Rats thrived in grain stores, fleas spread rapidly through crowded halls, and doctors had no idea how to stop it. Ironically, the very place designed to protect nobles from outside threats often doomed them from within. Imagine barricading yourself in a fortress only to seal yourself inside with a plague. And the treatments? Well, they were just as dangerous as the disease. Castle physicians used bloodletting, leeches, and strange herbal brews. Some nobles carried posies of flowers, convinced sweet smells would protect them. Others burned incense, hoping to drive away the sickness. But none of it worked. In fact, huddling inside castles often made death rates worse. Villages, with their open air and smaller populations, sometimes had better survival rates. You'd never guess, but peasants might have had the advantage. But disease wasn't the only killer. Fires tore through castles with terrifying speed. Kitchens, torches, and open hearths turned stone fortresses into tinderboxes. Once flames caught the wooden beams or roofs, the smoke was just as deadly as the fire itself. And since water was scarce, putting out a blaze was nearly impossible. Villages? Their houses burned too, but rebuilding a hut was easier than saving a castle crammed with people. Sometimes, the safe stone walls became a smoky tomb. Let's not forget war. Castles were prime targets during conflicts, and when sieges came, life inside turned unbearable. Imagine hundreds trapped for weeks. No fresh food, no clean water, waste piling up, and disease spreading. Some accounts describe castle residents boiling leather or eating rats to survive. Peasants in villages might flee or hide, but castle dwellers were stuck, waiting, starving, and praying for relief. Want to know the darkest part? Sometimes, the danger didn't come from the enemy outside. It came from betrayal within. Desperate servants sometimes opened the gates to attackers, hoping for mercy. Other times, nobles turned on each other, hoarding food while soldiers starved. Inside the mighty fortress, fear and hunger could break bonds faster than enemy swords. Meanwhile, peasants outside might be hiding in forests, eking out survival on berries and roots, but at least they weren't trapped in a disease-ridden stone coffin. Castles may have looked powerful, but inside they were falling apart. Let's take a closer look at daily life inside a castle. Forget privacy, hundreds of people lived and worked shoulder to shoulder. Servants, guards, cooks, and nobles all crammed into echoing stone halls. Noise was constant, clanging armor, barking dogs, shouting soldiers, and the endless bustle of chores. Add the smell of smoke, rotting food, and human waste, and you can imagine the sensory overload. Meanwhile, peasants in villages, though poor, often had quieter lives in small homes with their families. Sleeping arrangements were no better. Forget romantic bedrooms, most castle dwellers slept in shared halls, often on straw mats crawling with bugs. Even nobles had luxury beds stuffed with straw or feathers, but those quickly became nests for lice and fleas. Peasants had small wooden huts, yes, but they often slept with fewer people, sometimes just their family. Strangely enough, their sleep may have been deeper and healthier than that of nobles who tossed and turned in noisy, infested halls. And don't forget the animals. Castles kept horses, chickens, dogs, even pigs within their walls. These animals weren't in neat stables all the time. Sometimes they roamed the courtyards. Imagine the noise and the smell. Horses left piles of manure, pigs rooted through garbage, and dogs fought over scraps. Villages, animals lived outside in small barns or fields. Sure, it smelled, but at least it wasn't inside your living space. In castles, the animals were your neighbours, whether you liked it or not. Even the cleaning routines made things worse. Servants swept trash into corners or tossed it out of windows, chamber pots were emptied straight into courtyards or moats. Villagers, on the other hand, reused waste as fertilizer, or at least threw it far from their huts. In castles, the stench was inescapable. But there's one more reason castles were deadlier than villages. Their very design, the thick walls, the towers, the moats turned them into prisons during crises. During a siege or outbreak, those proud stone walls trapped everyone inside. Air circulation was poor, light barely reached the inner chambers, and food supplies spoiled quickly. The very features that made castles defensible also made them suffocating. Villages scattered and open gave peasants a chance to flee or adapt, but for nobles locked in their fortresses, the choice was simple: endure the filth and disease, or die with dignity inside their safe castle. Which life sounds better now? Let's compare meals again. Inside castles, food might look impressive: roasted boars, piles of meat, towers of pastries, but much of it was stale or spoiled. Banquets were less about nutrition and more about showing off wealth. Nobles stuffed themselves with heavy meats and rich sauces. Villagers, meanwhile, ate simpler but fresher meals: bread, vegetables, porridge, and the occasional bit of meat. Archaeological digs even show peasants were less likely to suffer from gout, the rich man's disease. Health was another shocker. Nobles might seem stronger, but constant feasts, lack of exercise, and smoky air made them sickly. Peasants worked hard in the fields, giving them better stamina. In fact, skeleton studies reveal peasants had stronger bones and fewer joint problems than many nobles. Yes, their lives were tough, but physically they were often more resilient. So while knights strutted in shining armor, peasants quietly outlived them in ways you'd never expect. Leisure time told a similar story. Nobles enjoyed hunting or tournaments, but these were dangerous games. A single joust could break bones or worse. Peasants had humbler pastimes: singing, dancing, playing simple games in the village square. And though their fun wasn't grand, it was safer. In a strange way, peasants may have laughed more often than the stressed-out nobles, who lived in smoky halls filled with politics, betrayal, and danger. Even medicine was upside down. Noble doctors charged high fees for bizarre treatments, while peasants often relied on herbal remedies passed down through generations. Surprisingly, some of those folk remedies actually worked like willow bark for pain, which contains the same chemical found in aspirin. Nobles, meanwhile, trusted in astrology or bloodletting, which could weaken patients instead of healing them. The answer might surprise you. Finally, let's look at mental health. Castles were filled with constant tension, fears of attack, rivalry among nobles, and strict rules of court life. Villages, while poor, had stronger community bonds. People worked together, shared resources, and supported each other during hard times. Life wasn't easy, but it was connected. In castles, loneliness and paranoia thrived behind thick stone walls. Sometimes, freedom meant more than riches, and peasants, in their small wooden homes, may have been the freest of all. Castles may have looked impressive from the outside: tall towers, stone walls, shining banners, but inside, daily life was filled with smoke, rats, filth, and fear. Villages, though modest, were often cleaner, fresher, and healthier. The contrast is almost comic. The poor lived in huts but breathed easier, while the rich lived in castles but choked on damp air. It's a reminder that appearances can deceive. What looked powerful and majestic could actually be suffocating and deadly. And yet, castles became symbols of power for centuries. Kings, dukes, and knights flaunted their fortresses as proof of wealth and control. But behind those walls, reality was far less glamorous. Imagine being a noble guest, riding up to a castle expecting grandeur, only to be greeted by foul smells, cold rooms, and the sound of rats scratching in the dark. So why, then, did castles remain such a dream image in stories and legends? Let's find out. The answer lies in image, not reality. Castles weren't just homes, they were propaganda. Their massive size intimidated peasants and enemies alike. They projected strength, even if the inside was miserable. Tales of knights and ladies polished the reputation of castles, turning them into symbols of romance and adventure. Over time, the filth and disease were forgotten in favour of stories about shining armour and courtly love. History loves a good myth, but myths often hide ugly truths. Think about it. Even today, when we picture the Middle Ages, we imagine castles more than villages. Hollywood shows ballrooms and banquet halls, not garderobes and rat infestations. But the reality was closer to survival horror than fairy tale romance. And if castles were this bad, what about medieval cities, with tens of thousands crammed into tiny filthy streets? That's a story even nastier than castles. But let's finish our castle tale first. In the end, castles were marvels of engineering but disasters for daily living. They kept out armies but trapped in disease. They showed wealth but hid misery. Villages, though humble, may have offered cleaner air, fresher food, and stronger communities. So next time you dream of being a medieval lord in a stone fortress, remember this. You might have been better off as a peasant in a simple hut, surrounded by family, fields, and far fewer rats. So why do we still dream of castles? Maybe because they look timeless, standing proudly on hills after centuries. Maybe because fairy tales taught us to see them as magical. Or maybe it's just human nature we're drawn to symbols of power, even when the truth behind them is grim. Castles remind us that history is often about image, not reality. And sometimes, the poorest villagers knew more about real comfort than the richest lords.